Welcome to VistaTalks, interesting discussions with interesting people from all around the world. I'm your host for today, Priscillia, and I'm joined today in studio by Margaret Kelleher. Margaret is the professor and chair of Anglo-Irish Literature and Drama at University College Dublin and author of the Mam Trasna Murders, Language, Life and Death in 19th Century Ireland. Thank you very much, Margaret, for being on the show. Really glad to have you today. So now let's move on and get on to the show. So Margaret, first of all, I'd like to ask you about yourself. Can you take us through your background?
Delighted to be here, Priscillia, and thank you for your interest in my work. It's every academic's dream to talk to a larger audience,
Thanks very much
to move beyond the ivory tower of the university, and I'm a great admirer of your work, so delighted to be here. As you mentioned, I hold the chair of Anglo-Irish Literature and Drama at UCD. My background is a BA in English and History, and then I studied for my doctorate at Boston College.
Oh, wow, fantastic.
And there's a nice history to the chair. It was first established in 1966. And when it was established in UCD in that year, it was the first of its kind in the world.
Oh.
And its intention was to recognise the distinctive nature of Irish literature in English.
Fantastic.
I think the term Anglo-Irish can seem maybe a slightly old-fashioned word now, but it's still a very lively concept that Irish literature in English is a distinctive tradition and thankfully a very lively one.
Yes, absolutely. Could you tell us a little bit about when did you arrive at UCD and what attracted you in studying Anglo-Irish literature, really? Where did the interest come from?
I've held this post since 2012, and previously I taught in Maynooth University, and I think in many ways my years as a doctoral student in Boston College had a shaping influence when I was studying as a graduate student in the late 1980s. Authors like Yeats, Joyce and Beckett were still taught as part of courses on British fiction or poetry or drama. I'm glad to say that isn't the case anymore, and one is less likely to encounter that. But I think there was a sense even then in the 1980s that people hadn't yet recognised that Irish literature in both its languages, English and Irish, should be recognised as its own tradition. So I suppose in many ways I've been a sort of proselytiser or advocate for that cause ever since.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, we're really glad that you became such an advocate, because now we get to talk about your current book. But before that, I just want to ask you a couple of questions. You've also co-authored various publications about the Irish society, including The Feminization of Famine, Cambridge History of Irish Literature, co-edited with Philip O'Leary, and Ireland and Quebec, Interdisciplinary Essays on History, Culture and Society, co-edited with Michael Kennell. And you were obviously guest editor on Era's Island special issue on Ireland and The Contemporary, published 2 years ago. So I understand part of your family was located in County Cork, right? And was bilingual in speaking both Irish and English at the turn of the 20th century. So is this where you kind of pick up, this interest as well of the Irish language and kind of this kind of attracted you and drawn even more than just like the work of Yeats and
Absolutely, and thanks for mentioning the publications. I think the most relevant one would be the Cambridge History of Irish Literature. One of the things that Philip O'Leary and I were very keen to do in that publication, which is a collection of 30 essays, is to represent both Irish language and English language writing, even though the project is written in English, and we're very proud of that. So, for example, the English language enters only in the 4th chapter, because the first chapter in that volume is on Irish writing and Hiberno-Latin writing in Ireland up until the year 800.
Wow.
And then the next chapter goes to 1200, and the next chapter Irish writing to 1600. So it isn't until the 4th chapter that one gets to look at
English language.
Exactly, and it's a good reminder, that English is a relatively young, what would you say, arrival on the cultural scene in Ireland if one looks at it, over 1500 years. But one of my regrets for that volume was really to do with its structure, because we had chapters on Irish literature in English and chapters on Irish literature in Irish. we didn't really have any chapters that were looking at the interrelationship between the traditions. And I suppose I had a sense there of a sort of unfinished business. One of the interesting things about Ireland in linguistic terms is, of course, the language shift, that we moved from being predominantly an Irish-speaking country to predominantly an English-speaking country, and that we did it in international terms quite rapidly and almost decisively. Thankfully not, and Irish continues to be a living language today, but there are times in our history it seemed as if that wouldn't be the case. So what interested me for many years is, how does a language shift happen? How does it take place? And of course, to move from being a culture that predominantly speaks one language to another, one needs significant periods of transitional bilingualism in between. And to my mind, that's still a topic that's very under-researched in Irish culture. Visitors to Ireland in the 19th century regularly commented on the fact that there were families where the grandparents spoke only Irish and very little English, and families where the grandchildren spoke almost only English with very little Irish. Of course, it's a very common story still today, particularly exactly for migrant communities, a very common experience. But it interested me, how did language matter in the 19th century? Did it matter if one spoke Irish or English, and were there periods of time when people spoke both languages? So that's, I suppose, the first influence. And then the second one, more briefly, is again, you've recognised that, is a personal one. For many of us in Ireland, the coming online of the Irish census 5 or 6 years ago was a treasure trove that we could all research our family. And to my surprise, I discovered that my great-grandfather, who lived in North Cork in the early years of the 20th century, was an elderly man at that stage, was bilingual. And Priscillia, I'd never known that. I would have thought that Irish had really gone from our family situation much earlier. But both my great-grandparents on that side were bilingual speakers of Irish and English. But what's very striking in the census form is that when one looks at the children, including the man, the boy really, who would become my grandfather, is that he spoke English only. So clearly the family
there was a shift,
were making the decision not to pass Irish on to their children. And at the very same time, a family just a few miles down the road, the Ahern family, which included a young woman called Margaret Ahern, who would emerge as my grandmother and would marry the young man I mentioned earlier. You had a very interesting variant in their family. Her parents, who were a little more well-to-do, relatively speaking, at that time spoke English only. But in the census form, when they recorded their children's linguistic ability, they recorded their children as bilingual, as speaking English and Irish, because at that stage, by the early 20th century, they were learning English in school. And of course, it's very unusual in a census situation to have children described as having a language that their parents didn't have. So clearly they were sufficiently proud of the fact that their children were learning English to record it in the census form.
Absolutely.
And to put that in more formal terms, it means that in one branch of my family we had an inherited bilingualism that was about to vanish. And on the other hand, we had a sort of acquired bilingualism, I suppose linguistics would call it, in terms of these children who were learning another language at school. So my impetus for this project in that sense was both a formal historical one, but also quite a strong personal one about a bilingualism in my family that I hadn't known existed.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I remember reading you in the preface saying that your sister was helping with the genealogy, right?
That's right. Research, my sister Gemma did wonderful work to help me find that, and indeed helped me to discover a lot of the mysteries in the Miles Joyce family as well, because as we'll find as we talk about this project, the genealogy in the book I've just written is also very complicated. So Gemma did great assistance there.
That's fantastic, yeah. I would love to do the same myself, really. So now I'd like to talk about your latest publication, The Mam Trasna Murders, Language, Life and Death in 19th Century Ireland, published in late 2017. So this book is a study of an infamous historical and unprecedented case in Ireland in 1882 that saw Miles Joyce, an innocent Irishman, being hanged for a crime that he had not committed. Could you take us through the story and tell us what happened, please?
I'd be happy to. And indeed would encourage people listening to the podcast to buy the book, and not least because there's a helpful glossary that will make some of these quite complicated details easier to follow, but I'm happy to have a go. At the centre of the book is a very tragic story. On the night of the 17th of August 1882, 5 members of a family were brutally murdered. They were members of the Joyce family. They lived in a townland called Trasna, which lay or still lies on the border of counties Galway and Mayo. 5 members of the family were brutally murdered. A man called John Joyce, his wife Bridget. Bridget was his second wife and stepmother to his children. 3 of his children were brutally affected by the murders. 2 of them were killed. Michael, who was only 17 years at the time, John's daughter Margaret, who was only 14 years of age, and his son Patsy, who was very badly injured, though survived, and was the only member of the family present that evening to survive. I suppose a final brutal detail was the death of John's mother Margaret, an 80-year-old woman who was bludgeoned to death, and the details of the murder are still very brutal to encounter, very brutal. One other member of the family, a man called Martin, just a young man at the time, was working in a neighbouring family, and by virtue of that, I suppose, lucky event, survived the night of violence. In the days that followed, a number of arrests were made, and to summarise this, I suppose, as briefly as one could, a total of 10 men were arrested and charged with the murders. They were local men, and as it emerged quite sensationally during the trial, a number of them were related to the murder victims. That's right. A number of the men who were accused were first cousins of John Joyce. And a further very striking detail is the main witnesses for the prosecution were another branch of the Joyce family, another set of first cousins, and in many ways these are some of the details that made the case so sensational at the time, and still I think makes it a very compelling one. The very grim details continue. 2 of the 10 men arrested turned what was called Queen's evidence at the time. In other words, they became approvers or informers against their neighbours and the others. And the trials took place in Dublin in November 1882. For people who know Dublin, they took place in Smithfield, in a historic courthouse at Green Street in Smithfield in Dublin. By then, as I mentioned, 2 of the men had turned approvers, so 8 men finally underwent a trial, and I think underwent is the word. One can only begin to imagine how shocking it was for these men coming from a rural area to find themselves in Dublin on trial for their lives. And 3 of the men were sentenced. All of the men were found guilty. 3 of them were sentenced to hanging and were executed, and 5 of the men were sentenced to life in jail, which at the time was a 20-year sentence. I suppose finally on the summary of the case, Priscillia, the details that have most resonated to the present is the recognition, which was the case at the time and I think was compounded over the years, that one of the men who was executed, Miles Joyce, was innocent. And Miles Joyce was a monoglot Irish speaker. He spoke Irish only. And for decades afterwards, the fact of his innocence reverberated down through time, and of course led, as we can talk about later, to his being pardoned just over a year ago.
Okay, yes. Thank you very much for that summary, if I may say, Margaret. So I actually want to come back on the last part, what we just discussed. 3 out of the 10 men who were arrested for the murder were sentenced to death, including Joyce. So 2 of them insisted that Joyce was innocent. Yet the last one, Joyce, was still executed, but he claimed his innocence up until the end, and saying in Irish, "I was innocent as a child in the cradle." So can you tell us really what happened?
How did that happen?
Yes.
In many ways, what is at the heart of the story is a sort of murder mystery, and I think there are details in the murder mystery that are still not fully known. For example, the motive for the murders, just to go back to that for a moment, is something that I think readers of the book, are especially interested in. And I have to say, hands up there, I have to leave that as an open question, though it seems to be that one of the motives was great rivalry, particularly about sheep grazing and about access to land, very old theme in Irish society. But certainly, if we can, I think, be agreed on anything or certain of anything, it is that Miles Joyce was innocent, and very much, as you say, the two other men who were sentenced to death on the eve of the execution attested formally, the documents still exist in the National Archives, that they were guilty. They admitted to being part of the murder party, though both men emphasised that they weren't the leaders.
Yeah.
But they also attested in very strong terms that Miles Joyce was innocent. It would seem that the system of justice at the time, and obviously justice is not really the most accurate word here, was so wedded to securing the convictions and the executions that it couldn't admit its own error. So on the eve of the execution, the Lord Lieutenant, whose home, I suppose ironically, was in what is now the President of Ireland's residence.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's right, in Phoenix Park, in what we now call Orsa Nuachtaráin, at the time was the Viceregal Lodge. He sent a telegram saying the law must take its course, and Miles Joyce was wrongfully executed. And you're absolutely right, I think, to pick out those lines. To recite them in Irish, they are Tom Cosair, Leis an Leanmh, a Tása Gliaváin. And that phrase, I think, is especially haunting one. I am as innocent as the child in the cradle. And language, I think, played a role in the case to the very end. Clearly, it played a role, and that's something we can come back to in Miles Joyce not having a fair trial, and the levels of injustice begin there. But also the issue of language played a role to the last, because to the very last moment of the execution, Miles Joyce protested his innocence in Irish, the language that he could speak. And we know this because at least one of the journalists present, by the 1880s, hangings were private, but we know that one of the journalists present could understand Irish. So for the account that he published the next day in the Galway newspaper, which he represented, he reproduced Miles Joyce in English, and that's really how we know what Miles Joyce said. But because he protested to the last, and this is especially gruesome detail, the noose slipped. Yes. And he died of strangulation rather than a broken neck. And again, I suppose the levels that reverberate down to the present, a man wrongfully executed, tried in a language which he couldn't understand, and experienced even at the end such a violent death.
Yes, absolutely, yes. You mentioned as well in one of your visits, United States, that there was a recent case of a man as well who was sentenced to death by a lethal injection as well, and where the course of events, if I may say, did not go as planned and died in dreadful circumstances as well. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, I think a book like this can change in different contexts, and in one context in Ireland where we don't have capital punishment, the case of Miles Joyce seems like a historic case. Yes. But then to talk about this book, for example, in North America, where capital punishment is still practiced, makes it a very different case entirely. And that for me was one of the key, I think, topics in the book, is in a way, and sometimes that's implicit in the book, sometimes it's explicit, is the links between the historical and the contemporary, and centrally to do with the issue of language. Miles Joyce's trial was conducted almost entirely in English. Mm-hmm. One of the great ironies which I discovered when I began to research the book is that the case was really complicated in relation to language. So, for example, because this case is a case that's still quite well known in Ireland, one of the things that's sometimes said is that none of the men could understand English. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that wasn't the case. The two men who were convicted before Miles Joyce were quite comfortable in English. They were really quite comfortable bilinguals because they had lived and worked in Ireland. Yeah. and England. They had lived and worked in England as agricultural labourers over a period of time. And what I discovered, Priscillia, when I began to research it, is that instead of it being as simple as none of the men could speak English, you had a spectrum of linguistic abilities. You had men who were accused, who were comfortable speaking English. You had men who had some English, and then you had the case of Miles Joyce, who definitely had no English at all. That's really clear from the research I did. That's one of the factors that makes the language shift so interesting at that time, that here we have a group of men more or less the same socio-economic class. In terms of age, they varied all right in generations, but they were from the same area. And at one moment of time, you had men who were monoglot, men who were bilingual. And of course, one of the reasons why I think this book is such an interesting I hope contribution to language shift and language studies is that we get to see how the possession of language played out so dramatically. One of the phrases I use a lot in the book is I say, who spoke what language mattered.
Yes.
That might not be grammatically perfect, but it's a good summary of some of the key themes in the book. Who spoke what language, who could understand English mattered greatly in this book.
So we talked about your interest in the Irish culture and language. Why did you choose to write on this particular case? How did you find out about this particular case in the first place? What drew you to write about this particular case?
It's funny how when one finishes a book and then looks back on the stages along the way, one begins to think it's lucky it exists at all, because my earlier plan had been to do a study of bilingualism in 19th century Ireland. And if anyone knows the novel George Eliot's Middlemarch, they'll know there's a character there, Casaubon, who's writing a book called The Key to All Mythologies. And unsurprisingly, Casaubon never finishes The Key to All Mythologies. And I think if I had tried to write a book about bilingualism in 19th century Ireland, it would never have been finished. But in the process of that work, I came across Man Trasna for exactly the reasons we've been describing, that it is such a good case study of larger sociological trends and larger forces of change in 19th century Ireland. And I think also as a study of injustice and the interrelationship of law and language, I think it resonates with people, in other countries, even until today. And that's one of the themes I suppose I'm particularly pleased about, is that the book would contribute to thinking more about the relationship of law and language. I was really surprised myself when I began to research this book to discover that interpreters were still being used in Irish courts as late as 1882. And one of the great ironies of this case is that there was an interpreter in court when Miles Joyce was being tried. But because the judge thought he could understand English, the judge didn't make the service of the interpreter available to Miles Joyce. Yeah. And instead the interpreter was used only to translate the evidence of the Irish-speaking witnesses. And I think that's an important point as we move to the present and begin to think about what ways in which our legal system serve or fail to serve, people who have very particular linguistic needs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's an excellent point. So we're now moving on to the findings, really, and the long-term significance of the book. As Margaret was explaining earlier, Miles Joyce was granted a posthumous pardon by President Michael D. Higgins on April the 4th, 2018. And a documentary television series was also produced on the case where the president said everything that happened at the level of the state was horrendous, and there was bribery involved. There was no atmosphere of equality, really. So from a state perspective, why do you think that it took so long to reach this decision, that to reach this posthumous pardon by Michael D. Higgins? There was something acknowledged before, but it was officially really granted only last year.
That's correct, and the quotation that you give from President Higgins, I think, is very, very, very powerful and well chosen. I think many people knew of Miles Joyce's innocence. In fact, there were times that it became almost a sort of rallying call for Irish nationalists, and certainly for many of the decades after the case, it became a shorthand really for injustice and the failure of the British legal administration in Ireland to provide, adequate justice to many of the people charged before it. Of course, one of the complications in a funny way was Irish independence, and indeed I think it took quite a bit of research by the Attorney General, by my colleague Dr. Niamh Howlin at UCD, who was deployed to investigate whether or not there was a case for a pardon, by the Irish government, and then finally the Irish government and President Higgins concluded that a pardon was warranted. And that continues now to make the case itself a pioneering one, because it's the first time in Irish history that a pardon has been given posthumously to a case where the conviction existed prior to Irish independence.
Yes.
We've had one case already of a posthumous pardon in Ireland, but not a posthumous pardon that predates Irish independence. It does mean for the descendants of Miles Joyce there is perhaps still some unfinished business. I know that his great-grandchildren they were present at the pardon. It was very moving. Members of whom, including Caroline Connaboy, would like to agitate further for a pardon from the British state, because the argument they make, I think compellingly, and I would be persuaded by that, is that a recognition by the British state is also warranted in this case.
Yes, no, I do understand, yes. What would be your opinion on how this case reflects on the translation needs of our society? You'd have certainly cases in which a defendant would be coming to court with very little English and would certainly need an interpreter. So what's your view on how this case affects our need?
I think for me that was one of my own discoveries in the process of writing the book, the way in which this, which is about a murder that took place in 1882, can still be a case with such contemporary implications. When I began to research the case, I thought of that in terms of the status of the Irish language, and of course that itself is an important development today. For me, that dimension, the contemporary implications of the case, has been one of the most surprising discoveries for myself. And that takes a number of forms. One of the forms it takes relates to the rights of Irish speakers today, the rights of those who speak Irish as their first language to perform their daily lives, including their negotiations, their interactions with the state in the language of Irish. We have legislative protection for that, but we often don't have the real practical services to enable that, and that's something, the need for that is something with which I profoundly agree. The second dimension, I think, I did not expect to encounter so powerfully in the final stages of the book, and it's one that I think really has resonated for a number of readers, and that is exactly as you described, Priscillia, the rights of new communities, new immigrants to Ireland who are not proficient in English, their rights to have legal services and indeed other state services made available to them in their own language. And there's a way in which I think that's becoming quite an urgent social issue. Certainly recent research by scholars like Kate Waterhouse, by Mary Phelan in DCU and others has shown that there is quite an urgent need by the state to resource interpreters more fully. A recent international study cited Ireland as an example of worst practice, not best practice, of worst practice in this regard, in relation to the resources that are being made available for interpreting services in courts. And of course, as we know, well-skilled interpreters need to be sufficiently remunerated, and if that work isn't being sufficiently remunerated at the most basic level, then the quality of the service will follow. And I think that's particularly the case when one thinks of a legal situation. You know, someone may have, I suppose, what linguists would call LEP, limited English proficiency, but to be faced by the court, a foreign alien situation, legal jargon, requires a particular element of proficiency, which I think many people in our courts in Ireland today do not have. And that does bring us, I think, very poignantly back to the case of Miles Joyce. And so part of my own agitation really in the conclusion of this book has been that we would see those people who find themselves in Irish courts today as the symbolic descendants of Miles Joyce, and that we need to ensure that the services that are provided to them are of the highest quality, that they're sufficiently remunerated, and indeed that the standards are sufficiently well monitored.
Would you say any particular, what would you recommend in terms of particular training? Is there anything specific that should be implemented, if I may say, by the state or by university trainings to ensure that we provide the best services?
I think for me, as I suppose an outsider looking at the case, it does come back to remuneration, so that people with, sufficient qualifications are encouraged to do that work. I think at a public level, the awareness that this is needed is itself a place to start. I think many people were surprised by that fact. It was something people hadn't really thought about, and I think there is a danger that because our state system can say that interpreters exist, that then is the end of the question. Yes. In the case of Miles Joyce, interpreters existed, but that certainly wasn't enough. So I think to answer your question, I think a lot of things are needed, from public awareness, perhaps at one end of the spectrum, to proper sourcing and remuneration at the other end of the spectrum. And it's an issue, I think, that's continuing in urgency, not just in Ireland, but elsewhere.
Yes, absolutely. In your book, you quote Professor Michael Crowlin, Chair Professor of French and the head of the French department at Trinity College Dublin, that we had the pleasure of interviewing in the studio last year, who highlights the lack of good interpreters when needed in such cases. To quote Professor Michael Cronin, there's absolutely no requirement that these interpreters be properly trained or that they have demonstrable proficiency in any of these languages they purport to master. The situation is one of a high degree of disorganization and a marked absence of regulation. Many existing practices are highly unethical, such as having young children interpreting for their parents in maternity hospital. But he also points out the fact that the case is not unique, and it's actually the case in Europe, in other countries, by saying that the Irish case is all the more disappointing, the one that would have thought that a country which had been bilingual since its inception would display a fair degree of sensitivity to language and translation issues. So it is interesting to, especially knowing that there's a lot of different communities at the moment migrating to different countries, Ireland being obviously a hub for many different countries, many different people, because obviously of job opportunities. So it is interesting, and you would wonder why. How can we improve, obviously, because the case of having young children translating for their parents is maybe, yeah.
That's right, and I think Professor Cronin's points bring out really well the danger that the system can be ad hoc and not regulated, and that again is a detail that parallels with some of the things I've been talking about in the book. So I suppose in summary, and by way of conclusion, for me it's a really important aspect to link history to the present. In one way, I'm aiming to do that by putting the language question back into how we think about 19th century Ireland. I think many of us, and I mentioned myself by example at the beginning, don't realise how close we are in our own family histories to the experience of bilingualism and to the experience of large linguistic and cultural change. and perhaps that understanding, to echo this point, might enable us to be more hospitable to linguistic difference today, and to argue for more support for those who find themselves in precarious situations, in challenging situations, and who deserve the best standards of justice.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you so much, Margaret. May we ask you, before the end of this interview, do you have any other projects that you'd be working on and you'd like to share with our audience today?
Well, one of the projects I'm delighted to share with you is that I'm currently working with colleagues in UCD and the National Library on a wonderful new project called the Museum of Literature Ireland. The acronym is MOLLY, for short, as in Molly Bloom. It's a literary museum that will open in Stephen's Green in summer this year, in the buildings where James Joyce studied as a young man, and it will focus on 20th and 21st century Irish literature, and I very much encourage listeners to visit Molly when we open in the summer of this year.
In the summer of this year. James Joyce, who also reported on the case.
Yes, indeed.
As a young reporter while in Italy. Well, thank you so much, Margaret. It was really interesting, and we look forward to the opening of Molly.
Thank you.
So that's the end of today's show with Margaret Kelleher from UCD. Please tune in again to see the next VistaTalks show, where we'll be discussing more interesting discussions with interesting people from all around the world.